Hey everyone, welcome back. In our last episode, we talked about how to choose which programs to apply to when you're pursuing graduate school in clinical or counseling psychology. If you missed that, be sure to check it out. I'll link it below. Today, we're shifting gears to focus on something just as important: how to make your application as strong as possible. Whether you're applying to master's or doctoral programs, we'll cover key strategies to help your application stand out. Everything from crafting a strong personal statement to securing letters of recommendation and making sure your CV shines. I'll be joined again by Amie Orsetti to share our best tips and advice based on our experience on both sides of the admissions process. And don't forget, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and might even answer them in a future episode. All right, let's get into it.
Yes and no. I found it difficult to start. I think I didn't know where to start or kind of how to start. Some universities will post examples. So if you, you can Google them too. I don't know how good those will be quality-wise, but some universities actually have examples on their websites of what they're looking for, which can be helpful just for the kind of content you want to include. Usually they're really short, like a page or two. So I think one of the things that I found really difficult was getting started, but then what's important enough to include and how do I make it so concise that I get everything that I want in on like 1 or 2 pages. So I think what I really did to just get started was I just started writing, and it was not 1 or 2 pages, it was pages and pages. And then I took a break and went away from it and then came back and was like, okay, what's important here? What can I cross out? What can I change from being a paragraph into 2 sentences? And try to go from there to kind of cut it down.
I think that's 1,000% the way to go, which is like the first draft, in quotes, like to just get stuff out. It will not be good. It will not, like writing these types of things. You've never had, you rarely, if ever, have to write things like this. So the first thing is just like to get a bunch of stuff out. So here are a couple of my suggestions. This is just sort of broadly for writing. Because so often it's like, how do I do that? How do I just get something out? Because I think there is something restrictive about sitting in front of your computer with the keyboard, your fingers, and that document thing. Like there's something about like, I don't even know where to start. So you want to get out of that like editor mind. So there are a few things I suggest. So one of them is handwrite. So I always suggest this, often suggest this. I do this a lot. Is I don't know why, but there's something about if I'm just handwriting, so I'm just getting ideas out, right? So turn down that ego and just get ideas out. That there's something about handwriting that I can just like let stuff come out. So I handwrite lots of stuff, and then so that's step one. And then however you want to get that to your computer, obviously there's lots of different ways. What I've come to do is I will then take what I've handwritten and I'll turn on some sort of voice to text on my computer, and then I'll read it to my computer and I'll type. And obviously it'll make some mistakes, but there's something. So one thing is if you read, it is very quick. So it's not nearly as long, at least for me, as like typing what I'd written. But then there's also something about that process where I will start to then do like a little bit of minor editing or shifting, or go, oh, I didn't hit this topic at all. Or, oh, I wrote two paragraphs on the exact same thing, or whatever. I don't know. There's something about that process where I think at the outset, a lot of us feel like, oh my God, that would be double work to handwrite it and then type it or put it in your computer. But it is, you do have to go through that extra step, but that extra step is valuable in and of itself. So you benefit from it. And it takes way less time than you think it would to get your handwritten text into a computer. Just a handful of minutes. It's not a big deal. So that's one way to do it. Another thing to do is to do some sort of a voice memo, just like talk it out. And you can talk it out going on a walk. You can talk it out in your office. A lot of times I find that I'm more creative when I'm walking around. So I will, close my door in my office and I'll just be walking around doing a voice to text, or I'm sorry, just doing a voice memo on my phone or whatever. Or the other thing to do, or another thing to do, is to have a conversation with someone like a peer or a partner, if you're able to sort of prime them so they can ask you good questions, and then record the conversation. That way,
Mm,
just sort of starts to flow better. So there are many others. But these are a few ways to just sort of like get ideas down and then
yeah.
working on reshaping them.
Um, One thing that you said that I think is important to highlight is, it might take a little bit more time, but I think it's worth it because I think there's something valuable about hearing that out loud and getting to kind of process it that way. I think that's kind of cool. But if you're worried about the time it takes to change it from writing it in handwriting to typed on your computer, you do not have enough time. Like these statements take time to write. Like you shouldn't be writing them 2 nights before. So it's worth putting that time in. Like I'm an over preparer and I like to be prepared in advance. So I probably started working on them earlier than a lot of people. But I think that was really valuable because I got to write a draft and then wait a week and then go back with fresh eyes and then read it again. So build in time. I think that's really important
Totally.
to do. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And then, oh, the other thing I was going to say is, like you're kind of talking about like a reflection piece in having a conversation with a partner and saying things out loud and kind of hearing it. And I think even before you begin writing, it's really worth taking the time to think about for yourself, regardless of what you write down, what your answers to some of these big questions are. Why am I going to grad school? Why do I want to go into this program? Where do I see myself in a counseling program or a clinical program or whatever? What is it that personally for me is really driving me to do this? Because I think a lot of the places where people struggle with writing these documents is feeling like, I don't know what to write.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have these motivations that are really strong and you've really thought through them, then you'll have things to write. You'll have a better idea of where you want to go with it. So I think, there's a lot of value in that too.
I couldn't agree more. And the one addition that I would make to what you just said is to when you're thinking about it and you're coming up with your reasons and your desires and your future directions and all that sort of stuff, have some way to catalog that.
Yes.
The human brain is terrible for remembering
Yeah.
these things. I mean, we all know how it is where it's, you have it, I don't need to write this down. I will remember. And the brain's trick on all of us, that you won't do it. You won't.
Yeah.
I don't. The amount of things
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I need to remember to talk to so and so about this when I see them later, and I see them, it's gone. It's gone, right?
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about these things, what I have is I have a little shortcut on my phone that I click on. It opens up a note, and I just catalog stuff. And so
Yeah.
it does not have to be structured in any way. The one thing I will say is make it so it's basically incomplete sentences. You have to think my future self will have no memory of this event. So my future self needs to be able to read this and remember and know what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
don't just do 2 words because you won't remember. So,
Yeah.
and I found if I force myself, I take the extra 7 seconds to write a complete sentence that, or
Mm-hmm.
two, that it's so much more helpful. So just as you're thinking about these things, as you're in the car, as you're in the shower, as you're going for a run, or as these things pop into your head, as soon as you can, just write them down somewhere, store them somewhere. So that way, when you go to write this, you have this library of thoughts that you can draw from. It's so much better than going with a blank page.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when you wrote your applications, do you remember how specific or focused you were in terms of your research interests or how you sort of did that?
Yeah, I approached it differently for different schools. So for my clinical application, I was super detailed. For my counseling, I was less detailed in, defining exactly what I wanted to do. But I had a pretty solid idea of the area I wanted to work in. It's an area I worked in for my honors thesis. I'd done a research paper on it before. So for that, like I wasn't detailed in saying, this is exactly the study I want to run, because I think, that can be beneficial, but also maybe harmful depending on if that excludes you from working with certain people. But I think I was pretty focused in the area that I wanted to work in on all my applications.
I think that
Yeah.
the essence of what you're saying is sort of what I typically suggest. Well, so one thing is to be honest. So if you know you want to work with a very specific population doing a very specific type of thing, be honest in conveying that. Right. So,
Mm,
like, I am going to graduate school because I want to learn about parents, a certain thing about parents with kids who have severe mental illness. Like, that's why I'm doing this, to do that. So then say that. That's great.
right.
So if it is that, if you're more flexible, what I encourage folks to do is to be able to communicate some sort of specific ideas, or depending on what
Mm,
the application requests, maybe a specific study or whatever, but also indicate that you have some flexibility.
right.
So you do want to be, if you are flexible, make sure to be overt about that.
Right.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I think that's good advice. I think that people get really caught up in, I need to have an exact idea of, this is what I want to do. Will you please take me? And if you don't, you don't. You're coming out of an undergrad. So, I mean,
Right.
you might not have an exact idea.
Right. And so one other thing that triggered is, um, you do not have to have experience in that area.
Right.
So, like, the last episode of the podcast was with Paul Hewitt, who's a perfectionism researcher, right? There
Yeah.
are, I should check with Paul, but I'm sure that many of this graduates, like, it would be ridiculous to think that people would have research experience on perfectionism when they apply to work with him. Like, that's silly.
Right.
So, I mean, it's not that it could never happen. Of course it could. And I'm sure if there was someone who did their thesis on, or their undergrad, whatever, on perfection, I'm sure he'd be like all excited. But that's less common.
Yeah.
So don't feel like you need to have that. So just because you did your bachelor's honors thesis let's say it was on perfectionism, does not mean that you have to only consider folks who are doing work on perfectionism.
Yeah, and that could actually show growth in you as a researcher as well. If you did an honors thesis in an area and then you're like, you know what, this actually isn't where I want to work, but through this process, I've figured out this is where I want to go. Like, that could be a compelling kind of story to lace through your application as well. This is what I've learned. This is how I know this is what I want to do. This is the direction I want to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you finished an undergrad.
Yeah. And I can say for the faculty side that when I'm looking for like seeds of stuff that I think will fit well with the types of stuff that I'm interested in. So,
Mm,
it might not be, so if they talk about a specific construct and I'm like, well, maybe not, that construct's cool, but I'm more interested in this sort of like adjacent construct, or this, maybe the thing they're talking about, but in a different context, or like, I'm just looking for like seeds of things that are like, oh yeah, that fits. Oh yeah, that fits. And then when
right,
I meet with students, that's when I'm going to really like evaluate if we are a good fit. Like, is that seed what I thought that was a seed of, or not? Maybe
right,
they're not
right,
actually willing to be flexible or that, or they're not interested in, considering this other thing. But I would say, the majority of time students are sort of like, yeah, I like this sort of general neighborhood of things,
yeah,
but they tend to be pretty flexible. So, yeah, I think being able to, successfully communicate, if it's expected in the application, like a specific research idea, then we do want to see that. Then the purpose of that exercise is to communicate to us that you can think that through. Um,
right,
but then if you are more flexible, to also indicate that in your application, like have that be clear. This is something I'd be interested in, but I'm also flexible. Um,
mm,
that also goes to, let's just jump to like the potential supervisors. A question I commonly get is, should I indicate more than one potential supervisor when I'm applying? Did you have any? I have no memory of what you did with that, Amie.
Which I think speaks to people who are nervous about applying and that, they may not remember everything you said. Um, no, so I indicated more than one. And I did so purposefully, um, as long as I was interested in more than one supervisor. So I think on all my applications, except for maybe one, I had at least two listed. And that partially comes from advice that I got when I was doing my undergrad that I'd reached out to supervisors to say, this is kind of my area. Are you taking students? I'd be interested in working with you. Some I heard back from, some I didn't. But if, they've changed their mind, or maybe they've decided to take a year off, or they're pregnant or whatever. What if they're not taking a student anymore and you didn't list anyone else? So I like the idea of listing two. I don't know how that comes across on your side of things when you're looking at the application, but I always thought that it was good to have two just in case.
Yeah, I generally think similarly, that you don't want to list everybody in the program. Now,
Right.
that being said, again, if you want to study parents of kids with severe mental illness and only one faculty member at the institution does that work, just list Dr. Smith, because she's the
Right.
only one who does this work. Cool.
Right.
Be honest.
Yeah.
But if you're more flexible, oftentimes there's a single faculty member that you're most drawn to. So sometimes I'll see folks who say I'm particularly interested in working with Dr. So-and-so. She does this. It's really cool, blah, blah, blah. And then sort of focused on that. And then they'll say, well, I am really interested in working with Dr. So-and-so. I think there's other research that Dr. Y and Dr. Z is working on, or Dr. Y's research on this thing, or Dr. Z's research on that other thing. That would also be really cool. Blah, blah, blah. So
Yeah.
I think it just sort of keeps the door open for other folks to consider you.
Yeah.
And that's really how I experience it on my end. And I've definitely taken students on both sides of that, students who have primarily indicated me and students who have sort of secondarily or tertiarily indicated me. And part of it is also that maybe this is a little bit of a different side of it, but that sometimes I'll, again, this gets back to not being up to date on our websites, that I'm in the middle of a project that is new and is a spinoff of other stuff. And so applicants don't even know that this topic is taking up a lot of my life. And so I would love to have somebody who's interested in this stuff, but they don't have any way to see that. Or it could be, I have several projects that are half done. So they haven't been published. So a person might not necessarily know that I started developing this thing or doing this thing. And somebody popping up who's interested in this type of a thing, they would never know I am as well. But if they popped up, they're oh my God, I would love to, I really want to get back into this, but just, I didn't have any students that were interested at the time. And, so I just and so other things pulled my attention, but this thing is still really compelling and whatever. And I would love to have someone so I could dive back into that. So I think that by listing a couple of names, 'cause to be honest, I don't look at, if I'm on a committee that needs to, then I will. But if it's just me looking for my potential supervisees, I don't look at every single applicant, So depending on the year and what I might just look at the applicants who indicate me as one of their potential supervisees.
So you might not even see an
supervisors.
application you'd be interested in.
Right.
If you weren't listed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think having a couple of, having that sort of I really want to work with Dr. Smith, but and there's also some work that this person, it just sort of keeps those doors open a little bit.
Right. I've had this question from students before about listing more than one supervisor. Would you ever or not you particularly, but people in general, do they ever take offense to be listed as number 2 or number 3? Would that ever be potentially an issue if you weren't listed as the first?
Yeah. So I've never heard that. I don't think. So I don't. I would say that the vast majority of folks would not be.
Right.
How could I say this? If somebody is really offended by that, you might not want to work with them.
That is exactly what I have said to students. I think that indicates something to you about
Right.
how
So
that
it's, yeah,
relationship
it's
would play
either,
out.
right. So it's either their insecurities or whatever, or it's maybe representative of a competitiveness among faculty in that given program.
Oh, interesting.
So and
Yeah.
that's interesting because in our, so I can honestly say that in our program, I don't feel that at all.
Mm.
I don't know why. Like I could absolutely see contexts where I could see fact, like I'm not above it. I'm not above, jealousy or vindictiveness or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
but I've never felt like, yeah, there isn't that. I mean, to be honest, I feel like it's quite the opposite often, where I've had students who I'm like, I would be really interested in working with that student. And there's somebody, one of my colleagues is also really interested. And like they're a newer colleague, or
Mm.
something like that. And so I'll say, oh, you go ahead. And then if for whatever reason you decide not to offer them, let me know. But I sort of like,
Right.
go ahead, so I think, and I've had people do that to me as well. So, I think
Hmm.
that it's much more of a like, how can we support each other and get students in the best place possible? Um,
Right.
so get back to your question. I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm sure that there are some people who might be offended, but if you have to tap dance around for tiptoe around that in your application, then I don't know if they'd be a good person you'd want to
Right.
spend the next 5 years with or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how about in your application, did you have like a
Hmm.
guiding framework for how much personal stuff to talk about?
Personal stuff is tricky. So I've heard kind of two things about this. The first would be it's a counseling application. They're going to want to see some kind of, personal motivations for being in this program, which in a counseling context could come as your own counseling, your own kind of background that has led you to this field. And then the kind of opposite swing of that is you do not want to use this as a place to overshare. You don't want to be going for, a pity offer or, pulling on heartstrings too much because it is an academic application. Um, so I think I swung kind of in the middle, in being honest enough about the reasons that I was applying to the program, what interested me in the field of counseling in general, what it was that kind of, led me to where I am, but being really cautious that details are not necessary. You don't want to be writing some kind of a plea to please accept me because of all the things that I've been through,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It needs to still be written to, PhD level professors who are looking at a whole myriad of factors and don't want to get to your personal statement and go, oh no, like, how do I handle this? So I think it's not wrong to include some personal aspects, but you need to be cautious about the way that you frame them and the level of detail that you get into.
Yeah, I think that's definitely how I would approach it, which is to you want to personalize it,
Hmm.
and there is a line of oversharing.
Hmm.
Um, and again, I think that we're talking from our perspective,
Yeah.
and there might be, I would say that in the context that we live in, this perspective is pretty typical.
Yeah.
Um, which is, yeah, you want to have it be personalized, but not certainly not disclose and say, I've been through this hardship, so you should let me in.
Yeah.
That's certainly not helpful.
Yeah.
But also, so there is a delicate line where, so for example, a lot of people, there is something about people that happen to folks in people's personal lives that's
Hmm.
influencing their career decisions or their research topic decisions in terms of their
Absolutely.
interest. Yes, the whole research is me search thing. Um, and but it's really like how it's done. So I've read applications, many, where they'll disclose something like a cancer diagnosis or a cancer experience for them or someone in their lives, and how that influenced their thinking or whatever, right? And that how like um, a, a way that it can be done well is something like, when my father, I'm going to make something up here. My father passed away from cancer when I was in my early teens, and we were really close, and it was really hard for me. And it was through the wonderful support of a grief counselor that she really helped me through it, which has really been a big influence on my interests in um, the process of grieving. Right. So like something
Yeah.
like that, where it's like, it is personal, it does help me understand, but
Hmm.
it's not oversharing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I mean, you could almost think of it as like a self-disclosure in counseling. Like, are you doing the self-disclosure for you, or are you doing it for the people that you're writing for? And how are you framing it? Because if, you're getting into a very emotional story now and the emotions are really, getting into your application, maybe it's less appropriate and you're just trying to find a place to share this.
Mm-hmm.
But if it is very pointed like that, and it does draw to the point of, this is why I'm motivated to be doing this,
Mm-hmm.
this is where this comes from, then I think that can be powerful if it's framed right.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Totally. Yeah. So I think that's something that, one has to be thoughtful about how you disclose stuff. And, something to do is to then take if you're not sure, write it and then give it to somebody and say, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
For sure. So in terms of writing, did you get any, well, of course you might not have had any notable ones in terms of how to talk about clear, I guess, I originally used the word weaknesses, but I almost want
Mm.
to take that back, because what I have noticed is sometimes applicants perceive something as a weakness that isn't a weakness. So,
Mm.
we'll get folks who apply, who are older.
Right.
And so in our program, that's not perceived as a negative in any way. Again, I think that
Right.
most of the time when when we're first going, adjudicating applicant, I don't know how old you are.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even really matter, or it doesn't even sort of come in. But we don't, it's not a. I think sometimes applicants will perceive it as a negative when it's not.
Right.
So that's why I'm a little hesitant
Right.
to use the word negative or weakness or something like that, because oftentimes it's sort of perceived rather than
Mm.
real. But probably a common example would be like a low GPA. That would be a common
Right.
example.
Yeah.
So do you, I don't know, was there anything that you had when you applied that you were like, oh, I have this, how am I going to explain this in my application?
I don't think there was anything that I specifically wanted to explain. Um, I think I did highlight, because I had just started in a job that was in a support role. And I wanted to highlight that, I'm newish in this job. I had, I think, a couple of months in the role at the time. But by the time I started the program, I'll have had like almost a year in this job. And it's, a really hands on kind of one on one support role. So my experience by the time I get to the program would be more than it is now. So I think I highlighted that. But I do know there was a couple of people that had just like a W on their transcripts for
Mm.
a course or two, um, for whatever personal reasons that had come up, that were really legitimate reasons, but were worried that when they applied for grad school, that would stand out as a red flag. And the advice that they got from instructors was to talk about it in their statements and just explain, again, briefly, not too emotionally, not too much in depth, but like explain, this was this unique situation where this happened, but I think the rest of my, transcript shows that I'm typically a hard worker, consistent, blah, blah, blah. So I think if they're one-offs like that, I think it's totally fine to just, and I think better to highlight yourself. This is what happened, this is why, than to just leave it there and be like, oh, maybe they won't notice.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that, well, I guess a couple things. So one thing is like, I feel like a W, like we probably wouldn't notice. Like, I mean, and depending on the situation, it's like, who cares? Like, so 4 years ago, you withdrew from a class in the middle of a term. Like, that could have been
Right.
for a million reasons, but also like, we've all, some of us just, you get into an advanced German class when you should really be taking intermediate German. And you're like, no, I can do this. And then, 4 weeks in, you're like, I don't know what they're talking about. And I got to get out of here. And so you get a W. Like, who cares? Like, it's fine. So anyway, so, I think there is something that, like, oftentimes with things like that, we won't see it. We just won't.
Right.
But I do think, like, Amie, your point about, like, noting it briefly is exactly right. So what you want to do is just have a sentence, maybe two, maybe, just commenting on it and then move on. So one thing that I will see is students or applicants will write a lot and they'll put it in multiple places. And it's sort of like, and it's like, what, oftentimes it's like so there are a lot. So like the German example I just gave, right? That's reasonable, right? Like, and like, yeah. And also we're not, if you were applying to graduate school in German studies or Germanic studies,
Yes.
that might be relevant.
Yes.
Right. But you're not, so we don't care. Yeah. And many of us can empathize. So, so that's something easy. In a case, a common thing. So there are a couple common things. I started undergrad as a bio major and I hated it. So my first year GPA is terrible. Right. So like that's very common. That's maybe a slightly more professional version of that sentence is all you need. In the second semester of my second year, my mom got sick with blank. I thought I could, complete the classes and be fine, but it really impacted my GPA, and is inconsistent. So, and then we read that sentence, we look at your GPA and we see there's one semester where there's a clear outlier. Great. Thank you for giving us the context. We should probably consider that when we're looking at your overall GPA. Wonderful. Moving on. Right. Yeah. And then there are other times where it's like, it can come across. So those are very reasonable, make sense situations. And other times it's this big, long story about all these things happening. And it comes across as sort of just defensive and not taking accountability. And it's important, particularly, I mean, in anything in life, to take accountability. And so, the accountability can be, I thought I could take 7 classes. I realized I couldn't. I thought I could, whatever it happens to be, like, that's great. That's like that we want that, right? We want people who can admit to their mistakes. So when it comes across as like, this wasn't my fault, this was blah, blah, and it's all over the place, that is definitely a negative for applications.
Right.
How about, so this is, okay, so which one should we, okay, so this is an interesting thing that I'm not exactly sure how I feel about. What was the advice that you got and what did you do when it came to reaching out to supervisors or potential supervisors?
Yes, so I did reach out to potential supervisors. The advice that I got was, if you're going to do it, like, you don't want to be writing them a 2-page email that's going to take them forever to read because they're just not going to read it. They're getting a lot of emails. So if you're going to be reaching out, it should be short enough that they can skim it quickly and get an idea of who you are and what you're asking. Have enough detail at the same time, which is a bit of a dance, that they can decide when reading that if it's worth replying to, if you kind of fit with what they're kind of like and what they're interested in. But also to do it early. And I think that advice comes partially because it can be a long process. Um, you might not hear back ever. You might not hear back for a couple of weeks, but then you might get an email, and then maybe they've asked you a question and you need to reply, and then you don't hear back for a couple of weeks. And if you're doing this with a couple of people, it can take several weeks or a month or two before you get your answer of, do you think you would fit as a supervisor? Could I list you as a supervisor? Would you be interested in working with me? So yeah, more time is better for that. That being said, when I applied to work with you, I didn't hear back from you. So I still got in. Take that with a grain of salt. It didn't matter in this case.
Sorry.
Don't put all your stock in it, I guess.
I apologize for not getting back to you.
No. I didn't take it personally. I didn't hear back from several people.
Yeah. So that's something and I've gotten better at it. I sort of have a canned response I send to most people now, just to reply. But if you do email people and you don't hear back, do not make meaning of that. So that's one thing. What I've learned over the years is that there's typically very little point in me having these conversations with applicants until I get their application. So there are the exceptions I make. So actually yesterday I met with a student who's in the class I'm teaching. And so that's kind of different because I already know that person. So it's like, I feel a sense of responsibility, I guess, for somebody in a class I'm teaching, to talk to them just about, just as I would for anybody in any class I'm teaching. If they're going to reach out, that I'm more likely to, I feel more responsibility than random person.
Yeah.
But that also, like, when I have, when you apply, you send a whole lot of information. And so once I have all that information, I can really dig through it and I can really understand applicants, or to an extent, which is much more helpful than if we just meet, with maybe a CV. It's like, I don't know what to do with that. So, in consistent with Amie, what she said, if you email a potential supervisor, keep it ridiculously short, very short. So when I get people who email me paragraphs, it's like, what are we doing? Like, what, like I can't, I'm not, no, like there's no way. Of course, the worst is when I get an email and it's like the wrong name, because obviously they just copied and pasted. Or like, you get those. So keep it super short. But I also think and again, this is just my opinion, it's just not necessary. It's just like, it's not, by and large, it's not going to help you. There might be some faculty who like to touch base with folks before applications. There could be exceptions to this, like somebody who is just like a perfect fit, and it's just like, or something like that. But otherwise, I think there is this, I think somehow it's become an expectation for students, or they have this expectation that I need to reach out to folks beforehand. And I just don't think that that's real. I just don't think it's real.
Right. I think that's worth highlighting too, is that like some programs you have to have a supervisor figured out before you can even apply to be accepted. Not for counseling, but for some like master's programs, you have to have a fit predetermined and listed on your application.
Like they have to have agreed to supervise you.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So all right, we can talk offline. You can tell me about this. This seems insane, but okay. Is it insane, or is it just me?
Oh, I think it's crazy. I think that should be handled after the fact. But I think that can permeate into the way that we think, though, when we're applying. Is like, I need to have some kind of a relationship on whatever small level with this person if I'm going to list them as a potential supervisor. So I think it's easy to kind of get into that headspace, and then yeah, like you don't care and you didn't get back to me and I got into the program, and yeah, things are just fine.
Yeah,
So
and we did
not
meet.
putting
We
too much
met.
stock in it.
We after you applied, we met, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. After I applied. Okay. Yeah. Sounds
great.
good.
Okay, so in terms of letter writers, some programs will say, we want 2 letters from academic and 1 from professional or whatever. So obviously, if they say that, do that.
Yeah.
What I always say, what should be your North Star when considering who I should get for letters of reference, or who should write my letters of reference, is who is going to write me the best letters of reference. So that should be your North Star. So come up with that list first in rank order. And so what does that mean? The people who are going to write you the best letters are people that you know the best. Typically, like,
Mm-hmm.
you can also factor in personality, but people that you know the best. So, or know you the best. They've seen you in the most different contexts. So before worrying about, should I get a person from this space or that space or whatever, first think who would be my best letter writers and then
Yeah.
work from that. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, we could do a whole episode on like how to work with letter writers, how to ask them, but let's leave that for now. So what are the, 1 or 2 other things, Amie, that you think we should hit before we roll?
I think it'd be worth talking about doing your CV and then maybe also briefly on interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so CV, I think put time into your CV. So I put a lot of time into my CV. It was not high on my list of documents at first because you have like, all these very specific documents that you need to write out for programs, but your CV is really important. It's where you're pitching to them, this is exactly my experience. This is why I fit with this program. Like I've been working on this for a long time. So I think it's really important to put time into that. I get questions a lot about, what kinds of experience, like what experience did you have? What will be the perfect experience? And that's such an individual question. It depends what program you're applying to, what your interests are, what kind of work you want to do. But I think like if you've taken the time to really focus on what you want to do, your experiences that are listed on your CV likely will reflect that. So I think there's a bit of trust that comes into that as well, that I have prepared myself. I am preparing myself in the way that is best for me and where I'm going. Like I get the question all the time, did you do crisis line? And I didn't. And I was successful in my application. So I think it's important to remember that just because you don't necessarily have the, quote unquote tick box experience that other people have, um, that doesn't necessarily mean that your application is weaker. It just means it's more unique to you. But put time into making sure that your CV is really clearly laid out so that people can read through it and see what kind of experience you have and
I
how that fits with your other documents.
Well, I think it's so important, and I think that's probably why I didn't have it, because it's so to me it's self evident, but that's totally unreasonable for somebody who's not done this before. And with a CV, more so than with any document, is like you have to decide, oh, what do I put on there? And so
Yeah.
I would say that what you should do is, even before you start writing your CV, start having some sort of a note document, something where you're just putting down all the things you might be able to put on your CV, right? All the experiences,
Totally.
all the
Yeah.
things. And like,
Yeah.
there are lots of things that you'll be like, no, I don't think I should put that. Just put it down first. And like, then you
Yeah.
can figure that out later. But also,
Yeah.
and then there are, if you haven't written a CV before, there are tons of resources online. Or if you're at an institute, at a university or college, there's
Yes.
probably an office of people who can help you with it. It
Yeah.
is like, a CV is a culturally based, like, what is valued on a CV, how it should go and be presented, right? This is just a culturally based thing that we do. So there is no
Yeah.
right or wrong in any sort of a, true sense of right and wrong. It's just like, what are the norms? in your particular context or culture. And if you're applying to a graduate program in, one discipline, it might be different than another discipline or whatever. So there's no reason that you should have that innate knowledge, right? So you have to use resources that are available to you to figure that out. So so I think that, so starting with just getting stuff down, and it still happens to me all the time where I'm working on my CV and I'm like, oh, I could include this. I forgot all about that thing. And I don't even want to think about the things that I've done that are lost to the sands of time that are not on my CV.
We'll never make it up.
Yeah. At this point, I've been around for long enough where the extra little committee or whatever doesn't really matter for me. But it just, again, we're not good at remembering things. So, so last thing then on interviews, was there something in particular? What do you think is most important to hit?
The most important thing I think for interviews is to know your stuff, because the people that you were talking to are likely sitting there with your documents that you wrote, and that is what they're kind of basing their conversation off of. And if you've applied to multiple different schools, you better remember what it is about this school and this supervisor that stuck out to you and why you've done it. And some of that should be intuitive. You shouldn't have to think too hard about some of it. But some of it, if you apply to, several different places, you're going to want to make sure that you're sitting there and what you're saying and what you're presenting is matching what they have in front of them. So I think, and also remembering that when it comes to talking about your research stuff, they're looking for, like you called them earlier, the seed ideas, not getting too worried about having to roll out this whole, well thought out research plan, but being able to talk passionately and honestly about your interests and why they interest you. Because I think that kind of, having that kind of passion for why you're there and what you're doing and why you're committed to this program, that shows through. People can look at you compared to people who are sitting there trying to just answer the exact right answer that they found online. If they can remember these 3 points, it'll tick all the boxes. I think if you're sitting there and you really care about what you're saying, that is really, really important when you're interviewing.
Totally. Enthusiasm does matter. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And sort of, we're not, I don't know, we don't feel like you need to be stilted and overly professional. Yeah, I think that like having some enthusiasm is a great, and I think that absolutely you need to know about that program, and in particular the one or two faculty that you want to work with when you interview.
Yeah.
So here's two things that I feel like either gets missed or underplayed. So one thing, when they're like giving you information about things, you could do a computer. It's a little impersonal to have that like that battleship thing where like the back of your computer is facing them. So I think if possible, something that you could like handwrite on is maybe a little more personal, but that's not a big deal. Take notes on what they're saying, even if you're just doing it performatively. I cannot tell you, it drives me insane. It drives me insane in all sorts of contexts when I'm sitting and talking to graduate school students about stuff and I'm telling them a bunch of things and they're not taking notes. I don't mean because it's like, you're not going to remember. So what are we doing?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Like show them the respect of like the information that you're giving me is of value. So I'm going to like take little notes. So that's super important. And it's just like, it's amazing. It still blows my mind how many people don't have that. I mean, like if I go in to talk to my department head or a colleague about, like, I will bring something so I can take notes, so if you can do it, and you should do it because hopefully it is valuable. The other thing is have questions, have more questions than you need. Have, go in and have them be both specific and general, and try to have them be, real questions that you have. You might have to generate some, but like I can't tell you how many times where I've said like, okay, so what questions do you have for me? And they say, oh, I don't have any, or they have like one or two. And it's like, what? Yeah. Like, you don't have questions, a bunch of them. And like, as you're talking to them and questions pop in your head, write them down. So that way, when you get to the question time, you can ask questions, or even while they're talking, say, wait, can I ask you a question about that? Or do you want me to wait? Like, be engaged. Big decisions, they want to see that you're engaged. That also goes back to Amy's enthusiasm piece. So those are a couple of things. Yes, totally. So those are a couple of things. And then the last thing I'll say is while you're interviewing, this is be nice to everyone. Like, be nice to any staff people. I mean, you don't have to be ridiculous. Like, if you're kind of a quieter person, you don't have to all of a sudden be, really out there and that's not what I'm saying. But like, be like showing that, just niceness, politeness, whatever. It really does matter. And that, there is, if you're interacting with staff, if you're interacting with current students, and if you behave poorly, it will get back to the people who interviewed you, and it absolutely can make a difference. So, okay. Well, Amie, thank you so much. This has been great. We didn't get to everything, but I feel like we did a lot. And then maybe what I'll do is if people have additional questions, comments, that they want us to cover, or clarifying things or whatever, and they let us know, we could always do this again. But until then, this is great. Thanks so much, Amie. That's it for today's episode. I hope this conversation helped you feel a little more confident about how to approach the application process. If you found this helpful, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. And as always, if you have any other questions or thoughts, please leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.